He locked the door, and I felt it in my bones before I heard the sound. The click echoed through the room like a verdict, quiet but final. I stood there in a dress that wasn't mine, in a life I hadn't chosen, married to a man whose name still felt foreign on my tongue. Adrian Romano. They said he owned half the East Coast, that men twice his size lowered their voices when he walked into a room. I believed it the moment I saw him. Not because he raised his voice or made threats, but because he didn't need to. Power clung to him like a second skin, tailored and precise, just like the black suit he hadn't even bothered to remove. He didn't touch me during the ceremony. Not when we said our vows. Not when cameras flashed and people applauded like this was something worth celebrating. Not even in the car ride here, where silence stretched between us for 27 miles of empty highway and city lights fading behind tinted glass. That scared me more than anything else. Because men who needed control didn't rush. They waited. He stepped closer now, slow, deliberate, like every movement had already been decided long before tonight existed. I could hear my own breathing, uneven, betraying me. I told myself not to step back, not to give him that. But my body didn't listen. It never did when fear settled this deep. Then he stopped. Just stopped. His eyes changed first. Not softer. Never that. Sharper. Focused in a way that made my skin prickle like I'd just stepped into cold air. He looked at me like he was seeing something he hadn't planned for. Something that didn't fit. Have you? He started, then paused, like the words didn't come easily to a man like him. Have you never been touched? The question hung there, heavier than anything else he could have said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My silence said enough. And for the first time since I'd met him, Adrian Romano lost control. Not loud. Not violent. Worse. He turned away from me like he was trying to put distance between himself and something dangerous. His hand braced against the wall, fingers tightening just slightly, like he was holding himself together by force alone. His shoulders rose and fell once. Twice. Controlled breaths. Practiced. But not perfect. I watched him, confused. This wasn't what I expected. This wasn't the monster they warned me about. This was something else. Something breaking. I should have stayed where I was. I should have let him rebuild that wall between us. But I didn't. I took a step forward. Just one. And that was enough. Because the moment he turned back, something had shifted. His control wasn't gone. It was sharper now, focused entirely on me. You don't understand, he said quietly, his voice lower than before, steady but edged with something I couldn't name. If they find out, he stepped closer again, not stopping this time. Not looking away. You won't be a wife to them. His gaze locked onto mine, unyielding. You'll be leverage. And in that moment, I realized something far worse than being owned by a man like him. I had just become the only thing in his world he couldn't control. The silence after his words felt heavier than anything that had come before, like the air itself had thickened around us, pressing against my lungs with every breath I tried to take. And I realized I was standing in the middle of something I did not understand yet somehow could not escape, because Adrian Romano did not speak in hypotheticals. He spoke in certainties, and the way he looked at me now was not as his wife, not even as something he owned, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Something unpredictable in a world he controlled down to the smallest detail, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever could. Leverage. I repeated quietly, the word foreign and sharp in my mouth, and he did not correct me, did not soften it, did not pretend it meant anything less than what it did. Instead, he stepped back just enough to create space between us again, but his eyes never left mine, calculating, assessing, adjusting, like he was rewriting a plan in real time. You should not have been part of this, he said finally, his voice steady again but colder now, more distant, like he had locked whatever had slipped earlier back behind steel doors. This was supposed to be simple. I almost laughed at that, the sound catching somewhere in my throat. Before it could fully form, because nothing about this felt simple, not the room, not the man in front of me, not the way my life had been traded like a signature on a contract. Simple for who? I asked, and something flickered in his expression, brief and gone before I could name it. But it was enough to tell me I had said something he did not expect, and for a second, just a second, I saw the difference between the man everyone feared and the man standing in front of me now, because one of them never hesitated, and the other one just had. He turned away again, walking toward the large window that overlooked a stretch of dark coastline miles below, the glass reflecting his silhouette back at him like a stranger he did not quite recognize. "For everyone," he answered, but it sounded less like the truth and more like something he had told himself too many times to question anymore. I watched him. The distance between us no longer measured in steps, but in something deeper, something harder to cross, because I was beginning to understand that this was not just about a marriage or a deal or even power. This was about control, and for the first time, I was the thing disrupting it. "Then send me away," I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out faster than I had time to think them through. "If I am a problem, fix it." He went completely still, not turning around, not moving, just still, and the silence that followed felt sharper than any response he could have given. "That is not how this works," he said slowly, each word deliberate, measured, like he was choosing them with care now, not for effect, but because something about this situation demanded precision. "Then explain it to me." I pushed, my voice steadier than I felt, because if I was already in this, if I was already part of whatever world he lived in, then I refused to stand there in the dark pretending I was not. "Explain why I am standing in a room I cannot leave with a man who just told me I am a weakness." He turned then, finally, and whatever distance had been between us closed in an instant, not physically, but in the way his attention locked onto me. Again, sharper than before. "You are not a weakness," he corrected quietly. "You are a liability." The distinction should not have mattered, but somehow it did, because weakness implied something personal, something emotional, and liability was strategic, controlled, something that could be managed, eliminated, or protected depending on the situation. "And what do you do with liabilities?" I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer would not be something I wanted to hear. His gaze did not waver, did not soften, but there was something else there now, something that had not been there when he first walked into this room, something complicated, layered beneath the surface of all that control. "I make sure they do not fall into the wrong hands," he said, and the way he said it made my chest tighten, because it was not a threat, not entirely. It was something else, something closer to a decision already made. And before I could respond, before I could ask what that meant for me, a sharp sound cut through the silence, distant but unmistakable, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to break the stillness of the night outside. Adrian did not flinch, did not react the way I expected. Instead, his entire posture shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but impossible to miss once you saw it. Every line of his body sharpening, focusing, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him. "Stay here," he said, already moving toward the door, his tone leaving no room for argument. But his hand paused on the handle, just for a second, and when he looked back at me, there was something in his eyes that had nothing to do with control, nothing to do with power, something dangerously close to concern. "And do not open that door for anyone but me," he added quietly, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed just as final as the first one, leaving me alone in a room that suddenly felt much larger and much more uncertain than before, because for the first time since this began, I realized the real danger was not him. It was everything outside that door that now knew I existed. The room felt too quiet after he left, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something I could not see yet. And I stood exactly where he told me to, staring at the door as if it might open again at any second, because part of me expected him to come back immediately, to say something else, to take back what he had said. But the seconds stretched into minutes, and nothing happened, just silence and the distant hum of something mechanical outside, maybe the ocean wind against the cliffs or engines far below, and I realized I was alone in a place that did not belong to me. In a life that had shifted in ways I could not fully grasp, I moved slowly, almost carefully, like any sudden motion might break something fragile in the air, my fingers brushing against the edge of the table beside me just to feel something solid, something real, because everything else felt like a carefully constructed illusion, the kind that looked perfect until you noticed the cracks, and Adrian Romano was the biggest crack of all. I had expected a monster, something simple to understand, something I could fear and distance myself from. But what I saw instead was control so precise it bordered on restraint. and something underneath it that did not belong in the world they said he ruled. Something human, something dangerous in a different way. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, replaying his words in my head. Liability, leverage, protection. None of them sounded like marriage. None of them sounded like anything I had imagined when they told me I would be his wife. And that was the problem. I had imagined nothing. I had been told what would happen and I had accepted it because I thought I had no choice. But standing here now, I realized something had changed, not outside, not yet, but inside this room, inside him, and somehow that changed everything. A soft sound pulled me from my thoughts, not the door, something else, faint, like footsteps passing somewhere beyond the walls, measured, controlled, and I froze without meaning to, every instinct sharpening at once, listening, counting the seconds between each step, because whoever was out there moved with purpose, not like a servant or someone lost, but like someone who knew exactly where they were going. And for the first time since he left, I questioned his command, stay here, do not open the door. It had sounded absolute, like everything he said, but now it felt like a boundary drawn not just to control me, but to protect something, and I did not know if that something was me or his world. I took a step toward the door before I could stop myself. Then another, slower this time, my hand hovering just inches from the handle, and I hesitated, not out of obedience, but because I realized I did not know what was on the other side. And that uncertainty felt heavier than fear, because fear at least had shape. This was something else, something undefined, something waiting. I pulled my hand back, forcing myself to breathe, to think, because reacting without understanding was exactly what someone like Adrian would never do. And if I was going to survive in whatever this was, I needed to learn that fast. Another sound, closer. This time, and then a pause, right outside the door, so close I could almost feel it, and my heart stuttered, not racing, just stopping for a second like it was trying to decide what came next. A shadow moved beneath the thin line of light at the bottom of the door, just enough to prove someone was there. And then a voice, low, unfamiliar, speaking just loud enough to reach through the barrier between us, Signora Romano. The title felt wrong in my ears, like it belonged to someone else. Someone who knew how to stand in this world without questioning it. He is occupied. The voice continued, calm, respectful, but there was something underneath it, something measured, like each word had been chosen with care. He asked that you remain inside. I swallowed, my gaze fixed on the handle, on the thin line between staying and stepping into something I could not take back, because this was it. The first real choice I had been given since all of this started, not by him, not by anyone, just by the moment itself. And I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. Whatever I did next would not just define how they saw me, it would define how he did too. I did not open the door, not because I was afraid of the man on the other side, but because I understood something now that I had not understood before. In this house, in his world, every action was a signal, every decision a statement, and the moment I stepped outside that door without him, I would no longer be something uncertain, I would become something defined, and I was not ready to give them that yet. Tell him I am exactly where he told me to be, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a moment there was silence on the other side, like the man had not expected an answer at all. Then a quiet, almost approving pause. Of course, Signora, he replied, and his footsteps retreated, slow, measured, until they disappeared completely, leaving me alone again with the weight of what I had just done. I stepped back from the door, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as if they needed something to hold on to, something solid, because the truth was I had just chosen to trust a man I barely knew, a man whose name carried more fear than comfort, and that realization should have unsettled me more than it did. But instead, something else settled in its place, something quieter, sharper, like the first edge of understanding. Adrian did not give orders without purpose, and if he told me to stay, then staying meant more than obedience. It meant positioning, it meant control, and somehow, in following his command, I had stepped into his world on my own terms for the first time. I moved toward the window again, drawn to the dark stretch of ocean below, the faint lights in the distance blinking like signals I could not read. The estate sat high above everything else, isolated, protected, like a fortress disguised as something elegant, and I realized that from up here, everything looked smaller, less threatening. But that did not mean it was. It just meant perspective could lie. A soft reflection caught my attention in the glass. Not mine. Something behind me, and I turned. Slowly, my breath catching before I could stop it, because I had not heard the door open, had not heard footsteps. But he was there anyway. Adrian Romano stood just inside the room, his presence filling the space without effort, his expression unreadable, controlled. But his eyes were different, darker somehow, not with anger, but with something that had shifted while he was gone, something that had settled into place. You stayed, he said, not a question, just a quiet observation. I held his gaze, refusing to look away this time, refusing to shrink back into the version of myself that had stood here earlier unsure of where she belonged. You told me to, I replied, and for a second, just a second, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something close enough to recognize. Most people do not follow instructions that easily, he said, stepping further into the room, closing the door behind him with that same quiet finality. But this time it did not feel like a trap. It felt like something else, something deliberate. I am not most people, I answered before I could stop myself. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the shift again, subtle but unmistakable, like a line had been crossed that neither of us could pretend did not exist. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the fine details in his expression, the tension that still lingered beneath his control, the calculation that never really left him. But now there was something layered beneath it, something that had not been there before tonight. No, he said quietly, his voice lower now, more certain. You are not. The silence stretched between us again, but it was different this time, less suffocating, more charged, like something had been set into motion that neither of us fully understood yet. Who was that? I asked finally, breaking the stillness before it could settle too deep. His gaze did not shift, did not waver. Someone making sure you follow instructions, he replied. But there was no edge in his voice, no threat, just fact. And that somehow made it more real than anything else he could have said. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, accepting it in a way that felt strangely natural now, like I was already adapting to rules I had not agreed to but somehow understood. And if I had opened the door, I asked, needing to know, needing to understand the boundaries I was stepping into. He did not answer immediately, his eyes studying me, measuring something I could not see. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but heavier. Then I would have had to remind everyone exactly who you belong to. The words settled between us, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. And for the first time, I understood that belonging in his world was not about possession. It was about protection, about lines drawn so clearly that no one dared cross them. And the most dangerous part was not that he could enforce those lines. It was that I was beginning to see why he did. The word belong did not sound the way I expected it to. It did not feel like a chain or a cage. It felt like a line drawn in the sand, sharp and unbreakable. And that was somehow more unsettling because it meant he was not trying to trap me. He was defining something, something permanent, something that extended far beyond this room. I do not belong to anyone, I said quietly, not as a challenge, not even as defiance, just truth, the kind I had held on to long before tonight, long before his name became part of mine. And for a moment I thought he would correct me, that he would remind me of the reality I had been pushed into. But he did not. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, like he was weighing the words instead of rejecting them. That is where you are wrong, he said finally, his voice calm, controlled, but not cold, not entirely. In my world, everyone belongs to something. I felt that land deeper than I wanted it to, because it was not said as a threat. It was said like a fact, something he had learned the hard way, something he had built everything around. And what do you belong to? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out softer than I intended, but it was too late to take it back. And for the first time since I had met him, Adrian Romano did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted, not away from me, but inward, like the question had not been asked in a long time, like it had not needed to be. Control, he said after a moment, the word simple, direct, but heavy with meaning. I belong to control. I studied him, the way he held himself, the precision in every movement, the restraint that defined everything he did. And suddenly it made sense, not in a way that justified it, but in a way that explained it, because a man like him did not survive without it, did not build an empire without it, did not stand in a room like this with absolute authority without holding on to something that never shifted, never failed him. Control was not just something he used. It was something he relied on, something he trusted more than people, more than promises, more than anything else. And tonight that control had slipped, just for a second, just long enough for me to see it. And I wondered if he realized that, if he knew that I had seen the crack before it closed again. And what happens when you lose it? I asked quietly, the question hanging between us like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. His eyes snapped back to mine, sharper now, more focused, and for a second I thought I had pushed too far, that I had stepped into something I did not understand. But instead of shutting down, instead of retreating behind that wall again, he stepped closer, not enough to invade, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional. I do not, he said simply. And there it was, the truth as he saw it. Not arrogance, not even denial, just certainty, because in his world, losing control was not an option, it was not a possibility he allowed himself to consider. And yet, I had seen it. I had seen the moment his breathing changed, the way his hand had braced against the wall, the way he had turned away like something inside him had shifted beyond his command. And I wondered if he knew that too, if he was choosing to ignore it or if he believed it had never happened at all. You did, I said softly, the words barely louder than a whisper, but they landed anyway. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened just slightly, in the way his shoulders stilled, not defensive, not aggressive, just aware. For a second, I added, not to challenge him, but because it felt like something that needed to be said. Something that changed the way this room felt, the way this entire situation unfolded. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but charged, like something had shifted beneath the surface and neither of us could pretend it had not. That second will not happen again, he said finally, his voice quieter now, but stronger in a different way, like he had already decided how to handle it, how to contain it, how to make sure it never repeated itself. And I believed him. Not because I trusted him, but because I understood him a little better now, understood the way he built walls around anything that threatened his control, anything that made him hesitate, anything that made him feel something he could not predict. But the difference now was that I knew the wall had a crack, even if he pretended it did not, even if he sealed it shut with everything he had. I had seen it, and that meant something, whether he wanted it to or not. You should rest, he said after a moment, stepping back just enough to create space again, the shift subtle but deliberate, like he was resetting the balance between us, placing things back into positions he understood. Tomorrow will not be as quiet as tonight. I nodded slowly, though I had no idea what that meant, only that it sounded like a warning, not a threat. And as he turned toward the door again, his hand resting briefly on the handle, he paused, just for a second, and when he looked back at me this time, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something that had nothing to do with control, nothing to do with power, something that felt dangerously close to recognition. Do not make me lose it again, he said quietly, and this time, I was not sure if it was a command or a confession. His words stayed with me long after he left, not because they were loud or threatening, but because they were quiet, controlled, and somehow more honest than anything else he had said tonight. Do not make me lose it again. It echoed in my mind as I stood there alone, staring at the closed door like it might give me answers if I looked at it long enough. But it did not. It just stood there, solid, unmoving, like everything else in his world. I exhaled slowly, pressing my hand lightly against the cool surface of the wall, grounding myself in something real, because the truth was I did not understand what I had just stepped into, not fully, but I was beginning to understand him, and that was more dangerous than anything else. I moved toward the bed without thinking, the fabric of the dress shifting quietly with each step, the room still holding that same heavy silence, but it felt different now, less suffocating, more deliberate, like it was waiting for something. I sat down at the edge, my hands resting in my lap, still, composed, even though my thoughts were anything but, because tonight had not gone the way I expected. Nothing about it had. I had been prepared for force, for control, for something obvious and easy to define, but what I found instead was restraint, precision, and something underneath it that I could not name yet, something that made a man like Adrian Romano step back instead of forward, something that made him hesitate, even for a second, and that changed everything. I leaned back slightly, my gaze drifting toward the ceiling, tracing the faint patterns in the dim light, trying to piece together what came next, because if tomorrow would not be quiet, like he said, then tonight was the only moment I had to understand where I stood, and more importantly, where I did not. A soft sound broke the silence again, this time sharper, closer, and my body reacted before my mind did. Sitting upright, my attention snapping toward the door, listening, waiting, because this time it was not footsteps, it was something else, something like a distant voice carried through the walls, too faint to make out words, but enough to tell me I was not alone in this house. Not really. I stood slowly, drawn toward the sound without meaning to be, stopping halfway across the room, because I remembered his voice, "Stay here, do not open the door," and this time it did not feel like a restriction, it felt like a boundary I was choosing to respect, not for him, not entirely, but for myself, because I needed to understand the rules before I broke them. I turned away from the door, forcing myself to step back, to put distance between me and the unknown on the other side, because whatever was happening out there, whatever had shifted in his world tonight, I was already part of it whether I liked it or not, and stepping into it blindly would only make that worse. I walked toward the window again, needing the space, the view, the illusion of distance. The ocean stretched out below, dark and endless, the faint lights along the shoreline barely visible now, and for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to be somewhere else, somewhere simple, somewhere where names like his did not carry weight, where doors did not lock with finality, where belonging was not something negotiated or enforced, but the thought faded as quickly as it came, because I knew better. I had known from the moment I stepped into this life that there was no going back. Not really, not anymore. A reflection moved behind me again, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but this time I caught it instantly, turning before it could disappear, expecting him, expecting that same controlled presence, but it was not Adrian. The door had not opened, and yet the shift in the air was unmistakable, like something unseen had just changed. I frowned slightly, my eyes scanning the room. The corners, the shadows, every detail suddenly sharper, more defined. Because instinct told me something was different now, something small but important. I moved toward the dresser, noticing it then, the faint outline of something that had not been there before, a folded piece of paper resting neatly on the surface, placed with intention, not left by accident. My steps slowed as I approached, my pulse steady but alert, because no one had entered the room. I would have heard it. I would have known, and yet this was here, waiting. I reached out carefully, picking it up, the paper cool against my fingertips, unfolding it with a precision that mirrored everything else in this house. The message was short, direct, written in clean, sharp handwriting that carried no hesitation, no doubt, just certainty. "You were not part of the plan," I read silently, my breath catching just slightly as the words settled in. Not because they were surprising, but because they confirmed something I had already begun to understand. I was not supposed to be here. Not like this, not in the way tonight had unfolded. I turned the paper over, half expecting more, but there was nothing, just that single line, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant whoever had written it did not need to explain, did not need to elaborate. They assumed I would understand, or, worse, that I would learn soon enough. I looked toward the door again, then back at the paper in my hand, and for the first time since this began, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and undeniable, because this was not just his world anymore. It was a game, and I had just been told, without warning, that I was already on the board. The words on the paper did not fade. They did not soften with time. They stayed sharp in my mind like they had been carved. There instead of written, "You were not part of the plan." I read it again even though I did not need to. Even though I already understood what it meant, not just the surface of it, but the implication beneath it, because plans like his were not built to fail. They were designed to eliminate variables, to control outcomes before they even had a chance to shift, and I was a shift. I was the thing that had not been accounted for. and someone else had noticed. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately. Like the action itself might give me more time to think, more time to understand what I was supposed to do with this. Because this was not just a warning, it was a message, and messages like this were never sent without purpose. I placed it back on the dresser exactly where I found it, aligning the edges as if that mattered. As if restoring order to something small could somehow bring clarity to something much bigger, but it did not. The room still felt the same, quiet, controlled, waiting. Except now I knew it was not as secure as it seemed. I turned toward the door again, my gaze settling on the handle, on that thin line that separated me from everything happening outside. And for a moment I considered opening it, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, because if someone could enter this room without being heard, if someone could leave a message without being seen, then the rules I thought I understood were already broken, and staying inside might not be as safe as I believed. But then I thought of him, of the way his voice had shifted when he told me not to open the door, not controlling, not even commanding, but certain, like he was drawing a line. That mattered more than anything else in that moment. And I hesitated, not because I was unsure, but because I was beginning to understand the weight behind that certainty. I stepped back again, forcing distance between me and the choice, because this was not just about whether I followed his instructions, it was about whether I trusted the reason behind them. And trust was not something I gave easily, not to anyone, especially not to a man like Adrian Romano. But tonight had not been what I expected. Nothing about him had been what I expected, and that made this harder, not easier. A quiet sound pulled my attention away from the door again, this time closer to the window. A faint shift in the reflection, subtle but deliberate, and I turned quickly, my breath catching before I could stop it, because this time there was no mistaking it. Someone had been here, recently, maybe seconds ago, maybe minutes, but close enough that the air still felt disturbed, like the room had not fully settled back into place yet. I scanned the space carefully, my eyes moving from corner to corner, from the dresser to the bed, to the window, searching for something out of place, something that did not belong. But everything looked exactly as it had before, controlled, precise, untouched, except for one thing. The curtains, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but they had shifted, just slightly, enough to suggest movement, enough to tell me that whoever had been here had not used the door. I stepped closer, my movements slower now, more deliberate, my hand reaching out to brush against the fabric, feeling the cool air that slipped through the gap, and then I saw it, the edge of a narrow balcony just beyond the glass, hidden from view unless you stood at exactly the right angle. The realization settled in slowly, heavy and undeniable. This room had another way in, another way out, one that did not require permission, one that did not follow the rules I had been given. And suddenly the message made more sense, not just the words, but the timing, the placement, the intent. Someone wanted me to know that I was not as protected as I thought, that his control did not extend everywhere, that there were gaps, openings, places where his rules did not apply. And that meant something, not just about him, but about whoever had written that note. I stepped back from the window, my thoughts racing now, not in panic, but in calculation, because if this was a game, like it felt like now, then I had just been given my first real piece of information, not about him, but about the world around him. And information like that was not given freely. It was meant to be used. The door handle shifted suddenly, just slightly, and my heart stilled for a fraction of a second before I turned toward it, watching as it moved again, slower this time, deliberate. And I knew instantly that this was not the same as before. This was not someone asking for permission. This was someone entering, and for the first time since I stepped into this room, I realized that staying inside might not have been the safest choice after all. The handle turned slowly, deliberately, not forced, not rushed, and that was what made it worse, because whoever stood on the other side was not guessing. They were not hoping the door would open. They knew it would, and for a split second I did not move. I just watched it, every instinct in my body sharpening into something cold and focused. Because this was the moment everything shifted from uncertainty to reality. The door opened just enough for a figure to step inside, quiet, controlled, and when it closed again behind them, the sound felt different from before, not final, but intentional, like it was meant to seal something in place. I did not step back. I did not speak. I just held my ground, because retreat would mean something here, and I was starting to understand that meaning was everything in this world. The man in front of me was not Adrian. That was clear immediately, not just from his face, but from the way he carried himself. There was no quiet authority, no calculated stillness that filled the room. This was something else, sharper in a different way, less contained, but no less deliberate. He looked at me like I was exactly what he expected to find, like there was no surprise in his presence here at all. You should not be alone, he said, his voice calm, measured, but unfamiliar, and I felt something inside me settle, not fear, but awareness, because this was not an accident. This was not someone lost or mistaken. This was someone who had chosen this moment, chosen this room, chosen me. Neither should you, I replied, my voice steady despite the tension tightening in my chest, because if he expected hesitation, I would not give it to him. His gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but over me, like he was taking in more than just what stood in front of him, like he was assessing the space, the distance, the variables, and then it returned, sharper, more focused. You read it, he said, not a question, and I knew instantly what he meant. The note, the message left behind without sound, without warning. I did. I answered, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, like something unseen had just been acknowledged between us, something that changed the nature of this interaction entirely. Good, he said quietly, almost to himself, and that single word carried more weight than it should have, because it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. This was not random. This was not impulsive. This was part of something structured, something intentional. Then you understand, he continued, taking a step closer, not threatening, not aggressive, but closing the space between us in a way that felt calculated, like he was testing a boundary. I understand that I was not supposed to be here, I replied, matching his calm with my own, because if this was a test, then I would not fail it by reacting without thinking. His expression shifted slightly, just enough to show approval, or maybe recognition. It was hard to tell. No, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. You were not supposed to matter. The words landed differently than the note had, deeper, more precise, and for a moment I felt that impact, not emotionally, but strategically, because this was not about me as a person. This was about my position, my role, the way I fit into something much larger than this room. And now I do, I said, not as a question, but as a realization, and that seemed to interest him more than anything else I had said so far. His eyes sharpened, studying me in a way that felt almost careful. Now you do, he confirmed, and there was something in his tone that made me understand that this was not a good thing, not in his world, not in Adrian's, not in whatever system they both operated within. You should leave, I said suddenly, the words coming faster than I expected, not out of fear, but out of clarity, because this was not supposed to happen. This was not part of the structure Adrian had tried to maintain, and I understood enough now to know that breaking that structure had consequences. The man tilted his head slightly, considering me, and for the first time since he entered, I saw something close to amusement in his expression. You think I am the one out of place, he said, almost softly, and I did not answer, because I was not sure if that was true. Not anymore. He does not know I am here, he added after a moment, his voice returning to that measured calm, and that changed everything, because it confirmed what the note had already suggested. There were parts of this world Adrian did not fully control, gaps in the system, places where someone else could move unseen. Then you should go before he does, I replied, and this time my voice was firmer, more certain, because whatever this was, whatever game I had been placed into, I was not ready to play it blindly. The man watched me for a long second, something unreadable passing through his expression, and then, unexpectedly, he stepped back, creating distance again, not retreating, but resetting, like he had seen enough for now. You are different than they said, he murmured, almost like a conclusion, and before I could respond, before I could ask what that meant, the door opened again behind him, faster this time, sharper, and the air in the room shifted instantly, not because of the movement, but because of the presence that followed. Adrian Romano stepped inside, and this time, there was no hesitation, no pause, no fracture in control, just one clear, undeniable shift that changed everything. Because the moment his eyes landed on the man standing in front of me, the entire room seemed to tighten around a single, unspoken truth. Something had just gone very, very wrong. The shift in the room was immediate, absolute. Like the air itself recognized him before anything else did. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not rush forward. He simply stepped inside and closed the door behind him. And somehow that was enough to take control of everything that had just unfolded. His gaze moved once, from me to the man standing a few feet away, and in that single glance, something unspoken passed between them. Something old, something understood without explanation. "You should not be here," Adrian said quietly, his tone even, controlled, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper, something more precise. The man did not move immediately, did not react the way I expected. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough to face Adrian fully, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "And yet I am," he replied, his voice calm, almost conversational, like this was not a confrontation, but a discussion already in progress. I stood where I was, the space between them suddenly feeling like a line I should not cross, not physically, not emotionally, because whatever this was, it was not meant for me, and yet I was already part of it. Adrian's attention shifted again, briefly, just for a second, to me, and in that moment I saw it. Not the fracture from before, not the hesitation, but something else entirely. Calculation, swift and absolute, like he was already adjusting to the new variable in front of him. And then it was gone, replaced by that same controlled stillness that defined everything about him. "Leave," he said, this time not to me, but to the man, and the word did not sound like a request. It sounded like a boundary, firm, unyielding. The man smiled slightly, not mocking, not disrespectful, but aware, like he understood exactly what that word meant and chose to ignore it anyway. "You know I cannot do that," he said. And there it was, confirmation. This was not a stranger, not an intruder in the way I had first thought. This was someone who belonged to this world just as much as Adrian did. Someone who operated by the same rules, even if he chose to bend them. "You already have," Adrian replied, his voice dropping lower, quieter, but somehow more dangerous in its precision. "You crossed a line." The silence that followed was heavier than anything else, because this was not about the room, not about me. This was about something larger, something that existed long before I stepped into this life. The man exhaled slowly, like he had expected this response, like he had prepared for it. "And you made a mistake," he countered, his gaze flicking toward me for the briefest moment before returning to Adrian. And that was enough. Enough to confirm what I already suspected. I was the mistake, not the marriage, not the deal, but me, specifically me, the way tonight had unfolded, the way things had shifted. "She is not part of this," Adrian said immediately, the words sharp, controlled, but final. And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, not because of what it meant, but because of how absolute it sounded, like he was drawing a line again, placing me firmly outside whatever this was. "She is exactly part of this now," the man replied just as quickly, his tone still calm, but firmer, more certain. "Whether you planned it or not." The tension between them did not rise in the way I expected. It did not explode. It did not break into something obvious. It stayed contained, controlled, but that made it worse, because it meant neither of them were reacting. They were calculating, adjusting, moving pieces on a board I was only beginning to see. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign that something beneath his control had shifted, but his voice remained steady when he spoke again. "You should not have come through that door," he said, and this time it was not about the room. It was about something else, something implied. The balcony, the hidden entrance, the gap in control. The man tilted his head slightly, acknowledging it without denying it. "And you should not have left her alone," he replied, and that landed. I saw it in the way Adrian stilled, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, because I knew what to look for now. The smallest fracture, the smallest shift, the moment where control met something it could not fully contain, and for a second, just a second, it was there again. The same thing I had seen earlier, the same thing he refused to acknowledge. Adrian's gaze moved to me once more, sharper now, more focused, not assessing, not questioning, but deciding. And I understood then that whatever happened next was not about them anymore. It was about me, about where I stood, about what I had already become in a situation I never asked to be part of. Go to the window, he said quietly, not loudly, not urgently, but with a certainty that left no room for hesitation. And this time, I did not question it. I moved, not out of obedience, but because I understood this was not about control. This was about positioning, about placing me somewhere specific, somewhere intentional. And as I stepped toward the glass, feeling the cool air near the hidden balcony brush against my skin, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. I was no longer just a liability. I was no longer just a mistake. I was something else entirely now, something both of them were adjusting for in real time. And the most dangerous part was not that I did not understand the rules. It was that I was starting to see how the game was played. The glass felt cold beneath my fingertips as I moved toward it, not because of the night air beyond the balcony, but because of the shift behind me, the quiet tension that had settled into something sharper, more defined. And I understood now that where I stood mattered just as much as what I said. Positioning, not just physically, but within whatever invisible structure governed this room. I did not turn around immediately. I did not break the moment by reacting too soon. Instead, I watched the faint reflection in the window, two figures standing behind me, both still, both controlled, but neither passive. This was not a standoff. It was something more precise, more deliberate, like two people adjusting to a change neither had planned for, but both intended to control. You brought him here, the man said after a moment, his voice calm but edged with something that felt almost like accusation, and I saw it then. The way Adrian's posture shifted just slightly, not defensive, not aggressive, but anchored, like he was grounding himself in something solid before responding. No, Adrian replied, his tone even, unshaken. He came on his own. The distinction mattered. I could tell by the silence that followed, because in this world, intent was everything. The difference between action and reaction could define everything that came next. That is not how this works, the man countered, stepping just enough to the side that his reflection aligned with mine in the glass, close enough that I could see his expression clearly now, composed, but not indifferent. There was purpose there, layered beneath the calm. Everything works until it does not, Adrian answered, and this time there was something else in his voice, something quieter, but more certain, like he had already accepted the shift that had occurred tonight, while the other man was still trying to correct it. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself, because the more they spoke, the clearer it became. This was not about control alone. It was about expectation, about plans that had been carefully constructed and now forced to adapt. And I was at the center of that adaptation whether I wanted to be or not. You think you can contain this, the man said, his gaze flicking toward me again, not lingering, just enough to reinforce the point. You always do, Adrian. Did not respond immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, said more than any words could have, because it was not hesitation, it was calculation, weighing options, outcomes, consequences. I do not need to contain it, he said finally, his voice lower now, steadier. I need to control how it moves. The words settled into the room with quiet force, and I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharper than before, because control was not about stopping something. It was about directing it, shaping it. And if that was true, then I was not just a problem to be fixed. I was something to be positioned, something to be used, and the realization should have unsettled me more than it did. But instead, it clarified something I had been feeling since the moment he walked back into this room. I was no longer outside of this. I was part of it. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be, the man said, his tone shifting slightly now, less measured, more pointed, like he was pushing for something, a reaction, a decision. And you are underestimating it, Adrian replied without missing a beat. And there it was again, that certainty, not arrogance, not denial, but something grounded in experience, something that told me he had seen situations like this before, even if not exactly like this, even if not with me. She changes nothing, the man insisted, and this time his gaze held on me just a second longer, long enough to feel the weight of that statement, to understand what he meant by it. I was not supposed to matter, not to them. Not to whatever system they operated within. I was supposed to be replaceable, insignificant, a detail. She changes everything, Adrian said quietly, and the room went still, not because of the volume of his voice, but because of the certainty in it, the absolute nature of the statement. And for the first time since this began, I felt something shift that had nothing to do with fear or confusion, something steadier, something more grounded, because that was not strategy, that was recognition. And the difference mattered more than anything else that had been said tonight. The man studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled again into that calm, controlled surface. Then you already know what comes next, he said, softer now, less confrontational, more certain, like this was not a question, but a conclusion. Adrian did not look away from me when he answered, his gaze steady, unbroken. Yes, he said, and there was no hesitation this time, no fracture, no shift, just clarity, and somehow, that was more unsettling than anything else, because it meant whatever came next was not a reaction, it was a decision already made. The man nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, like he had expected nothing less, and without another word, he turned, moving toward the door with the same quiet control he had entered with. But before he reached it, he paused, just briefly, glancing back at me one last time. You were not part of the plan, he repeated softly, echoing the message left behind, but this time it felt different, heavier, like a warning instead of a statement. Now you are the plan. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with that same quiet finality, leaving me standing at the window with the reflection of Adrian, Romano still watching me. And for the first time, I realized that whatever game I had been pulled into, it was no longer about survival alone. It was about what I would become inside it. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt defined, like something had just been decided and the room itself had accepted it. I did not move right away. I stayed where I was by the window, my fingers still resting lightly against the cold glass, watching Adrian's reflection instead of turning to face him, because somehow that distance made it easier to think, easier to breathe, easier to understand what had just changed. You are the plan. The words echoed in my mind, not loud, not urgent, but steady, like something inevitable, and I realized that whatever I thought this was before, whatever I believed I had stepped into tonight, it was no longer that simple, not for him, not for me. What did he mean? I asked quietly, my voice breaking the silence. Without urgency, without fear, just clarity, because I was done pretending I was not part of this, done pretending I could stand on the outside and watch it unfold. Adrian did not answer immediately, and I saw it in the reflection, the way his gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but inward, like he was choosing his words carefully, not to control the situation, but to define it. He meant exactly what he said. Adrian replied finally, his voice calm, measured, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that had not been there earlier, something closer to truth than strategy. I turned then, slowly, facing him fully, closing the distance between reflection and reality, because I needed to see him clearly, not as a silhouette, not as a presence, but as a man who had just acknowledged something neither of us could ignore anymore. Then explain it to me, I said, holding his gaze, not challenging, not resisting, just asking, because understanding was no longer optional, it was necessary. His eyes met mine, steady, unwavering, and for a moment I thought he might refuse, that he might retreat back into control, into distance, into the version of himself that kept everything contained and untouchable. But he did not. Instead, he stepped closer, not enough to close the space completely, but enough to make it intentional again. This marriage was supposed to stabilize things, he said, his tone even, factual, like he was laying out a structure piece by piece, a predictable alliance, a controlled variable. I listened, absorbing each word, because this was the first time he was not speaking in fragments, not giving me pieces to interpret, but actually explaining, actually letting me see the framework behind everything that had happened, and I was part of that. I said quietly, not as a question, but as confirmation. He nodded once, a small, precise movement. You were part of the agreement, he corrected, and there it was again, that distinction, subtle but important, because part of the agreement meant something defined, something contained, something that did not change the structure itself. But now I am not, I said, and this time it was a statement, not uncertainty, not confusion, just recognition, and I saw it in his eyes, the way they sharpened just slightly, not in rejection, but in acknowledgement. No, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Now, you are a factor. The words settled differently than everything else he had said tonight. Not liability, not leverage, not even mistake. Factor, something that influenced the outcome, something that could not be ignored or removed without consequence. And for the first time, I understood exactly where I stood, not outside the system, not controlled by it, but inside it in a way neither of us had planned. And what does that change? I asked, because that was the only question that mattered now. Not what I was, but what that meant moving forward. Adrian did not hesitate this time, did not pause, did not calculate. Everything, he said, and there was no ambiguity in it, no room for interpretation, just certainty, the kind that did not come from guesswork, but from experience, from knowing exactly how quickly things could shift when something unexpected entered the equation. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle, letting it take shape in my mind, because everything meant more than just tonight. It meant tomorrow. It meant the people I had not met yet, the situations I had not seen, the consequences I had not imagined. It meant I was no longer just reacting. I was part of the cause. Then tell me what happens next, I said, and this time my voice was steady in a way it had not been before, not because I was unafraid, but because I was no longer uncertain, and that made all the difference. Adrian watched me for a long second, something unreadable moving beneath the surface of his control, something that did not belong to strategy or calculation, something closer to decision. Next, he said quietly, you stop being what they expect. The words settled between us, not as instruction, not as command, but as something else entirely, something closer to a shift, a transition, and I felt it then, not in the room, not in him, but in myself, because for the first time since this began, I was not just trying to understand his world, I was preparing to move within it, and that was when I realized the most dangerous part of all of this was not him, not the man who had just left, not even the game they were playing. It was the fact that I was no longer just a piece on the board. I was starting to learn how to play. The shift inside me did not feel dramatic. It did not come with a sudden burst of courage or defiance. It was quieter than that, sharper, like something settling into place after being uncertain for too long. I looked at him, really looked this time, not as the man I had been given to, not as the name that carried weight in rooms I had never entered, but as the person standing in front of me who had just told me to stop being what they expected, and I realized he was not asking me to become something new. He was asking me to stop pretending I was not already changing. And what do they expect? I asked, my voice steady, because that mattered now. Understanding their expectations meant understanding how to break them. Adrian's gaze held mine, unwavering, but there was something different in it now, something less distant, less guarded, like he had already made a decision about me and was no longer holding back from it. They expect you to be predictable, he said, his tone calm, deliberate, quiet, compliant, easy to define. I let that settle, because it was not wrong. That was exactly what I had been until now, what I had allowed myself to be because it was easier, because it required less resistance, less consequence, but that version of me did not fit here anymore, not in this room, not in this world. And if I am not, I said softly, watching him closely, because this was where it shifted, this was where the line he had drawn earlier either held or broke. Adrian stepped closer, the distance between us narrowing again. But this time it did not feel like control. It felt like alignment, like we were standing on the same side of something instead of opposite ends of it. Then they will not know where to place you, he replied, and there was something almost precise about the way he said it, like it was not just advice, but strategy, something tested, something proven. I exhaled slowly, because that made sense more than anything else he had said tonight. Unpredictability was not weakness here. It was leverage, the kind that could not be measured or anticipated, the kind that forced people to react instead of plan. And that gives me time, I said, the realization forming as I spoke it, and I saw it then, the faintest shift in his expression, not surprise, not approval, but recognition, like he had expected me to reach that conclusion. It gives you control, he corrected quietly, and the word did not feel the same as when he had said it before. It did not feel like something rigid or absolute. It felt shared, adaptable, something that could exist in more than one place at once. I held his gaze, letting that settle between us, because this was the first time control had not felt like something he owned entirely. The first time it felt like something I could step into as well. You said you belonged to control. I reminded him, my voice softer now, but no less steady. What happens when it belongs to both of us? The question hung there, not challenging, not confrontational, just honest, because I needed to know where that line existed. If it existed at all. Adrian did not answer immediately, and this time the pause felt different, not calculated, not measured, but real, like the answer was not something he had prepared, not something he had needed to consider before tonight. His eyes did not leave mine, but something in them shifted, something deeper than the control he had built everything around, something that did not fit neatly into the structure he relied on. Then it becomes something neither of us can fully control, he said finally, his voice quieter than before, but heavier, like the truth carried more weight than anything else he had said, and I felt that, not as fear, but as understanding, because that was the risk, not losing control, but sharing it, allowing something unpredictable to exist within it. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed or disagreed, but because I understood, and that understanding changed something, not just in me, but in the space between us. Because this was no longer about him managing me, or me resisting him. This was something else. Entirely, something neither of us had planned, something neither of us could fully define yet. A soft knock broke the moment, quiet but precise, and we both turned toward the door at the same time. The shift. Immediate, not tense, but aware, because nothing in this house happened without purpose. Adrian's expression reset instantly. The brief fracture of something unguarded disappearing beneath that familiar control, but I knew it was still there. I had seen it, and that mattered. Yes, he said, his voice steady as he moved toward the door, opening it just enough to speak to whoever stood outside. A low exchange followed, too quiet for me to hear, but I watched the way his posture changed, just slightly, the way his shoulders squared, the way his attention sharpened, and I knew something had shifted again. Something beyond this room, beyond us. He closed the door slowly, turning back to me with that same controlled stillness. But this time there was no distance in it. No separation, just clarity. They know, he said simply, and the words settled into the room with quiet finality. Not loud, not urgent, but absolute. I did not ask who they were. I did not need to, because I understood. Now, understood enough to know that whatever came next would not wait, would not hesitate, would not give me time to adjust, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel unprepared. I felt ready, not because I had control, but because I understood what it meant to have it taken, and what it would take to take it back. Then we do not wait, I said before I could stop myself, the words coming out steady, sharper than anything I had said all night. And for a moment Adrian just looked at me, really looked, like he was seeing something he had not expected to find, not fear, not hesitation, but clarity, and that changed something between us again, subtle but undeniable, because this was no longer about him explaining his world to me. It was about me stepping into it without being asked. No, he said quietly, his voice lower now, more grounded. We do not. And there was no resistance in it, no correction, just agreement, the kind that did not come easily to a man like him. I moved away from the window, not retreating, but repositioning. The space in the room feeling different now, less like a place I had been brought into, and more like something I was learning to navigate. What do they know? I asked, because that mattered, not just that they knew, but how much. Adrian stepped closer, not closing the distance completely, but enough to make the moment intentional. They know the structure has changed, he replied, his tone precise, controlled. They know you are not what you were supposed to be. I absorbed that, the weight of it settling in a way that did not overwhelm me, but sharpened my focus. Because if they knew that much, then they were already adjusting, already moving pieces in response, and that meant time was no longer something we had. It was something we had to create. Then we make sure they cannot predict the next move, I said, the thought forming as I spoke it. Not planned, not rehearsed, just clear. Adrian's gaze held mine, steady, and for a second, just a second, there was something in it that did not belong to control or calculation, something closer to respect. You are learning fast, he said quietly, and it was not praise, not. Exactly, it was recognition, and that mattered more than anything else he could have said. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in that moment, because everything felt like it was moving now, shifting beyond this room, beyond this conversation, and I needed to stay ahead of it, not just react to it. I do not have a choice, I replied, and the truth of it did not feel heavy. It felt defining, because this was where I stood now, not outside, not waiting, but inside, moving, deciding. Adrian nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, and then his attention shifted, not away from me, but outward, like he was already mapping what came next. They will test you, he said, his voice calm, but certain. Not directly, not at first. They will watch, they will wait, they will try to understand where you fit. I listened carefully, because this was not just information, this was preparation. This was the part of the game that happened before anything visible changed. Then I do not give them a place to put me, I said, the answer coming easier now, not because it was simple, but because I understood the principle behind it. Unpredictability was not just a tactic, it was a shield, a way to exist without being defined by someone else's expectations. Adrian's expression did not change, but I felt the shift anyway, the subtle alignment of thought. The way his silence confirmed I was not wrong. Good, he said after a moment, and that single word carried more weight than it should have, because it meant I was no longer just being told what to do. I was contributing to what came next. A soft vibration broke the stillness, not from the door, not from outside, but from somewhere on him, and Adrian reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone, his gaze dropping to the screen for just a second before returning to me. Sharper now, more focused. It has started, he said simply, and there was no urgency in his voice, no panic, just certainty. Like this had been inevitable from the moment everything shifted tonight. I felt my pulse steady instead of rise, because I understood that too. Understood that this was not the beginning. It was the continuation of something already in motion. Then, we move first, I said, and this time there was no hesitation at all, no second guessing, just clarity. Adrian studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled again into that controlled stillness. But it was different now, not distant, not guarded, just aligned. Stay close to me, he said quietly, and this time it did not feel like possession. It felt like strategy, like positioning, like something we both understood the importance of. I nodded once, not because he told me to, but because I chose to, and that difference mattered more than anything else. He moved toward the door, opening it without hesitation, and for a split second I saw it. The world outside this room, the movement, the structure, the silent coordination that existed beyond what I had seen before, and I stepped forward without waiting, without looking back, because there was nothing behind me anymore. Not the life I had before, not the version of myself that had walked into this. Only what came next, and as I crossed that threshold beside him, I realized something that settled deep and steady in my chest. He did not pull me into his world, I walked into it on my own, and that changed everything.